Greetings YouTube, this is DecKrash, better known as Brandon. Okay, so now I'm presenting part 3 of my reading of Her Hand in Mine. As you can see, I changed the picture from just a picture of me to actually the two main characters of the story. That's Jules and Sarvana you're looking at. That's how I had envisioned them. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get this started, seeing how reads take a little bit of time. Hope you enjoy it, and as always, please give me your opinions down in the comment section, or if you want to PM me about it, I'd be more than happy to hear your critiques of the story. I'm really hoping that this can garner some interest. So, without further ado, here's my continuation of Her Hand in Mine. Sarvana and I spent the weeks that remained of our month at Blue Point, happy and carefree. After work, I would meet her at the train station, and we would spend the rest of the day doing whatever caught our fancy, whether it was all-night games at the arcade, dinner at one of the innumerable restaurants, spending time at the zoo to watch all the exotic animals from Lost Earth and the colonies, or just sitting back in the picnic area with food we brought at the bazaar, and watching the fireworks that were often programmed to the simulated sky. Every day was an adventure, which I cherished sharing with my closest friend, every day bringing us closer as we made up for those lost 10 years. With no one to scorn or ridicule us, I grew to not only tolerate our closeness, but began to desire being closer to her. Or more accurately, we began to desire more closeness to each other. In restaurants, while humans and Felians held lively conversations across the table, Sarvana and I sat beside each other, playing trivia games on the tank suspended above the eating areas, or holding conversations of our own in remote corners of the more reserved eating establishments. Upon the hills of the picnic areas she would lie beside me, purring intermittently, and then giggling with girlish abashment as she told me more about her travels with her father. Sometimes she worked to refresh my knowledge of Felian vocabulary, and I realized that I remembered much more than I thought. Every day together had become our own private heaven. But as my days with Sarvana were bliss for me, whenever we parted ways, I descended into the hell that was the burn, which evaded all my efforts to find an explanation for. Every night that I returned to New Valis, I sought out Keisha like a wolf on the hunt, and exhausted the floodgate of the inexplicable need until she and I collapsed into a tangled mess of sweating limbs. She loved it, of course, but I was becoming increasingly frustrated and confused with each passing night, as well as fearful that she would begin to drop subtle hints about asking her to stop her daily contraceptive regimen. To be honest, I was surprised that she didn't ask it of me by the end of the second week, but I was nevertheless grateful that she hadn't. I was in no way ready to have a child with Keisha, though I was almost certain that she would agree to it if I asked. Despite the intensity of the sex we shared, which I admit was nothing short of mind-blowing, my primary desire was to find out where this strange attraction had come from. I considered going to a doctor, but the possible consequences of such a visit kept me from going down that road. My previous disinterest in women sexually, combined with admitting my closeness to a Felian, would almost certainly raise questions I wouldn't like, as well as end in a mandate that I wouldn't want. And there was considering my parents in all this. I learned, much to my further chagrin, that Chester had informed them not only of Keisha and I, but also of Sarvana. I honestly had expected this. Chester could never keep his mouth shut when it came to my affairs. He was a total gossip to rival even the best of the old aunties in my sector. As expected, my parents, and after they had been informed my siblings, were ecstatic about Keisha, and had not stopped assaulting my phone and computer with questions about when Keisha and I were going to choose to have a baby. My older brother Jasper completely jumped the gun and asked me flatly when the baby was due. They were understandably upset when I crushed those dreams, but remained optimistic. As for Sarvana, it was basically a rehash of Chester's tirade in my home, to which I had to smile and nod at least 1,000,000 times. Fortunately, my family was never attracted to or latched on to drama, and the interest in my situation died to a slow simmer. Still, the problem lay in the back of my mind, ever present and certain as the burn that would accost me every night and send me into Keisha's arms. All that changed the week before Sarvana was to leave. I pulled a week's worth of sick days in order to spend the final week with Sarvana. I sighed, the certainty of the day of her leaving weighing heavily on me as I stared at the framed 8x10 3D image upon my desk. It was a picture of us together, sitting by the massive marble water fountain at the center of Blue Point, her furry hand tightly in mine, and smiling as broadly as I was. It was a happy day for us, as every day together at Blue Point had been, and I tried to smile with the memory of it. But even now, despite my best efforts, that smile was robbed from me. I could not push away the inevitability of that day. "Only 7 days," I whispered in the silence of my home. The doorbell rang and shook me from my melancholy. Though I was thankful for it, I was also suspicious. I hadn't been expecting anyone, but it had admittedly been a while since I had last spoken to Chester. He was never without companionship, usually of the female kind, but he did take a special delight in our time together and always made time for me. He was none too happy as to my reasons for taking those sick days, and aside from my having to practically bribe him into silence for this coming week, I had been shirking him for the past couple of weeks in favor of Savannah's company. "You picked a hell of a time, Chester," I mumbled as I went to the door. "I'm about to leave, you know. Told you about this week. It's the last week that..." The sight of Savannah standing on the other side of the door brought me to silence. She smiled at me wordlessly, and I hurriedly brought her inside. "Vanya, what's the matter? I thought you were going to meet me at Blue Point. You might blow my cover if I'm seen with you." "You're worried about getting fired?" Savannah asked teasingly. She giggled, and for some reason the sound of it ignited a ghost of the burn in the back of my mind, fainter than that second night with Keisha, but nonetheless present. Inwardly it startled me. "No, not that," I said. "But I'd get into some serious trouble if they learned that I took sick days off to go and play at Blue Point." "But it would be quite worth it, wouldn't it?" Savannah said, sauntering towards my shelf of trinkets once more. She shot me a glance over her shoulder, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Yes," I said after a moment's thought. I followed her until I was standing close beside her, her tail swishing from side to side with interest at my collection, swept against my leg, and she laid her head on my shoulder. "Thank you," Savannah whispered. "What for?" I asked. "For taking off this week." "How could I not do it?" I said. "You'd do the same for me." Savannah nodded. "Yes, you're right." We agreed to take separate routes for the train station, as well as separate trains to Blue Point as not to arouse suspicion. I arrived first and waited for her outside the train station. All the while I began whistling a familiar tune, which I learned no sooner than Savannah had arrived, had come from a familiar sound. Savannah gasped with delight when she stepped out of the train station and came to my side. The music filled the air, a lively jig, a medley of flute, piano, accordion, fiddle, and drums, mixed with excited rhythmic clapping from the amphitheater over the din of crowds that brought back a memory so strong that it struck me as almost reality, when Savannah had led me to their source, bouncing in rhythm to the wild music. She and I had first met this way, at a Tri-City swap meet at Blue Point. A band like this had played. The style of the music had become a style and tradition on Zinj in the days after the Imperium Wars. It was a simple, natural music that echoed rolling hills, brooks, forests, and the green that was taken from us, but possessed a power that could move us to tears at the loss of it that our ancestors suffered, or drive us wild with merriment at the memory of its beauty. The Felians had just arrived then, and a special celebration had heralded their arrival and elongated stay. Accustomed as I was to the music, I knew all the folk dances and caught on quickly to dance with the other children. A few Felians joined in, mostly Ankhya Felians and a few Reikya, and provided their own odd embellishments to the dance, much to my amusement. But I noticed one younger, gray-furred Felian standing there. She was bobbing in rhythm to the music, but glanced about furtively and uncertain. There were no other children around, Felian or human, who were not dancing, and so I approached the Felian girl and brought her into the merriment. She was understandably nervous at first, but the infectious music quickly held her in its sway, and she was soon dancing just as gaily as all of us. I admit that even at that tender age I was quite impressed. Felians had a keener sense of balance than the human, and moved with much more speed and physical grace, and so the Felian girls soon outdanced us all. After the session ended, I went to the refreshment stand and returned with 2 cups of fruit juice. "Thank you," she said in a tiny voice as she accepted the drink I offered. She had spoken English with a pronounced accent at the time, and haltingly as if she was still learning it. "You dance really well," I said. "What's your name?" "Sarvana," she said. "But father calls me Vani. My friends call me Vani. So you can call me Vani too." She looked up from the drink and blinked large violet eyes at me. I remember even then how pretty I thought they were, but of course it was beneath the dignity of a boy to make comments like that, unless of course prompted by an adult. and my parents were too busy dancing to instruct me at the moment. At the time, I thought it was rather presumptuous of her to assume that she and I were friends, but of course, time brought us closer together until the day she had to leave. And this last month brought us closer than I ever imagined possible. The present. Servana was dancing. She was dancing with me at the amphitheater in the midst of a melody that was mad and lively. She danced just as lively and just as graceful as before. No, more so, and she was so very beautiful. She spun around, long embroidered falls of midnight hair swirled about her, along with her dress and tail. I was a fair dancer, and never shirked the opportunity if there was one, if there was a gathering with a mind to do so, but my skill and balance paled in compared to Servana's, as her body moved in perfect rhythm with the music, bending and twirling in ways that no human ever could. A smile as wide as a Cheshire cat played upon her face, and her large violet eyes all the while were set upon mine. She was beautiful as we danced into the artificial night, fast and then slow and then fast again, with no fear of ridicule and not caring about who saw us. We held hands and she danced in my arms, and the unbridled joy of the moment set me free. We were like two bottles of champagne on the way back to New Vallis, shaken and ready to burst with happiness. Servana understood that we needed to be discreet here. She had once confronted me with the question of why I had been so standoffish and had proceeded to tickle the answer out of me, and so she kept her distance until we arrived at my home. Drunk with happiness, we danced again in the middle of the kitchen floor, earning our fair share of bruises for the lack of room. Somehow we found ourselves on the couch in my living room, still laughing and stinging from the respective bumps. "Oh, I see you moved it," Servana abruptly remarked, indicating the silver necklace that she had not accepted, which now rested upon the coffee table with the bottle of jewelry cleaner next to it. She gave me another one of her wry grins and switched to Felian. "So tell me, Jules, have you learned what Nali is?" "Funny you should ask," I replied in English. Giving a grin of my own, I carefully moved the necklace aside and picked up the large worn book that it rested upon. "I meant to show this to you," I said, presenting it to Servana. I'd forgotten that I even had it until I started shifting through my old junk boxes. Servana opened the book and gasped. "Oh, Jules." Her tone was low and filled with endearment as she flipped over the first page, which contained a picture of myself and Servana, drawn with crayons in a child's crude manner, but very vibrant and detailed. We were in the arboretum and holding hands. Surrounding the depiction of ourselves were lines of tiny multicolored script, Felian calligraphy, badly scrawled but repeated, practicing the symbols over and over, determined to learn them properly. "I practiced hard back then," I said, noting how the symbols caught Servana's eye. Servana said nothing for the longest time, only flipped through the sketchbook while making even ever more endeared noises. Her tail twitched rapidly as she gazed on, revealing page after page of drawings depicting her from various angles and surrounded by a litany of Felian calligraphy. After a time, I began to recognize the letters becoming parts of actual words, but they were just random sentences and phrases that I recalled Servana teaching me. "There it is," I said, stopping her and pointing her towards the page. It was another drawing of Servana, much better and more detailed than the earlier sketches. She sat on a hill, smiling, with a large sun overhead. It must have been taken after a trip to Blue Point, I surmised. Surrounding her were more Felian words, and their English equivalents, and there beneath her the word Na-Li, written in clear Felian cursive. Below it were several English words: mate, marriage, engagement. "It seems that I repaired that necklace and unwittingly made it into a Felian betrothal gift," I said, laughing in spite of myself. "Isn't that something?" "Isn't it?" Servana said in that same low voice. She leaned onto my shoulder as she turned the page of the book, and nearly dropped it as her hand went to her muzzle. Her eyes overflowed with emotion. It was a very detailed drawing, more sophisticated than the scribbles I had made in the beginning of the sketchbook, and the only one where Servana was not present. It showed me looking up into a black nighttime sky, waving goodbye to a sketch made of lines of silver from a paint pen, lines that created an approximate shape of a Felian craft. Surrounding the image was the ubiquitous Felian calligraphy, whose glyphs this time repeated the same phrase. "Ne ki tu yan," I said, reading the Felian phrase aloud. "I miss you." Servana's voice was heavy, almost quavering when she spoke. "The wrinkles on the page. She ran her hand over an area where the ink that was used to make the words had splotched. "What happened?" "Tears," I said. I recalled that day, clearest of all my memories from that time of my childhood. Its pain was forever etched into my mind. I cried for a week after. I didn't eat or sleep. Mom and Dad thought they'd have to take me to the doctor before I finally learned to accept that you were gone. I don't know why it hurt me so badly. I mean, I've had friends move away before, but you were different, Vonnie. It was like a hole was ripped out of my life when you left, and I couldn't explain why. At a glance, I saw Servana staring at the floor as I talked. I was fairly certain that she was listening to me, but her stillness unnerved me somewhat. "You know, I think that's when my artwork started looking like Felian stuff," I said, trying to keep a conversation going, however one-sided it had become. Its style, its images, its lettering. It's managed to creep its way back into my work ever since. I smiled at her and reached out to touch her cheek. "And all because I missed you." "I cried too," Servana suddenly ejected. She turned and looked into my eyes, and I saw the tears that rapidly began to seep into the striped fur upon her cheeks. "I cried too. I'm sorry, Jules, but I did." She grimaced and continued before I could say anything. "I promised myself that I wouldn't, but when the ship began to lift off, it just happened. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. It wouldn't stop. I couldn't help it." She wailed and buried her muzzle in my shirt, her hands squeezing onto the fabric of my sleeves as I sat there, stunned at the Felian woman who had come to mean so much to me, immobile as she poured out her pent-up sorrow into my breast. And her sorrow drew tears from my eyes as I held on to her in my otherwise empty home. "For a week, Jules," she whispered, a wet, quavering groan. "A full week, same as you. Even Father wasn't able to console me. He said that I was like he was when Mother died. I tried as hard as I could to forget you, but it was as if a piece of you remained with me, never letting me forget. And at times, I knew that I didn't want to forget. I've traveled across known space, Jules, from Anrahara to Hemlock. I begged Father to continue traveling despite his desire to return home. I want to try and forget. And not a day that has gone by that I didn't think of you. It was only by chance that we were chosen to return to Zinj. It was like a dream come true to me. I was ecstatic until Father told me that it would only be for a month." Her hands slid from my sleeves, and I caught her arms. Her fur was warm and like silk in my grip. "I wish I could stay here with you, Jules. Human attitudes and not. I wish that we had forever together, in a place for just us and no one else." It was a beautiful dream, I knew, but not possible, though at the moment I wished desperately that it was. Unfixed humans like myself were too valuable for our society and were rarely ever allowed off-planet. "But we only have this week," I remarked sadly, entwining her fingers with mine. "And we must make the most of what we have." I leaned forward and touched my forehead to hers, wiping the tears from her soft cheeks with my sleeves. As I did this, Servana, without warning, moved forward and pressed herself against me. Softly and gently she nuzzled my cheek and purred with abandon. "I've never been as happy since you came back," I murmured, and recalling Felian customs of affection, made a far more intimate gesture. When Servana withdrew her cheek from mine, I touched my nose to her own. "Even now?" Servana asked. Her eyes closed in delight at my gesture, and she ran her nose lightly back and forth against mine. "Especially now," I said. "During the dance, I couldn't take my eyes off of you. You were beautiful. You've always been beautiful to me, I think, even as a kid." "1 week," Servana whispered faintly, still running the velvet softness of her nose upon my own. "1 week to make the best of," I said in a voice that had a purr of its own. When I kissed her, I took her by surprise. I heard her sharp intake of breath at this human display of affection. She had seen it before, but I was certain was unfamiliar with the experience herself. I felt her stiffen, but she did not pull away. My hand went to her face as she took initiative and deepened the kiss. It was a little bit awkward as her mouth was slightly larger than mine, but it did not make it any less intimate or pleasurable. My head was swimming when our lips finally parted. Wasting no time, I shared with her the affection I felt for her in the Felian way. Servana's tongue was soft across my lips, but my tongue to her lips was softer still, and sweet as our kiss when my tongue passed over them. The blood was rushing to my head in torrents. I'd read that Felians much preferred the human expression of affection, and Servana proved this to be true, as she was quick to bring me into another, deeper kiss. I felt her hands slip out of mine and move upon my back as my lips traveled down her tiny muzzle and to her neck. As I heard her breathing grow more rapid and my own breaths quicken their cadence, I felt the tips of her tapered, sharp fingernails rake against the fabric of my shirt as her purr became a faint growl. I did likewise with my hands, minus the fingernails, of course, and pressed her to me, as if we had but seconds left, rather than a week before we would be torn from each other. "Jules?" Servana wrested herself free from my embrace, abruptly pausing in our pleasured interlude. I gazed at her questioningly. The heat from my body and the look in her eyes as they struggled to focus upon me were evidence of how much she wanted this, but nevertheless a part of me wanted to howl in frustration at her sudden cessation of it all. "What's wrong, Vani?" I asked in a husky, breathless voice. "Do you really want this?" she asked. Her ebony hair was disheveled in the most alluring way, and the fabric of her top had already loosened, revealing much more of the cleavage of her breasts than was conducive to my thinking straight. "I mean, is this more than just playing around to you? I have to know, do you really want me?" Her question ground away my instincts in a most inconvenient moment of reason. I actually had to think about this, if at least for a minute or two. My thoughts in those few moments went back to our conversation of several weeks ago, and how Servana expressed her disdain for our liberal attitudes towards sex. I most certainly had taken the liberty of sharing a bed with Keisha every night previously, despite how much I was normally disinclined towards sex for the fun of it. Although I hadn't read into it much, I was certain that Felians had a much more stable view of relationships. I had not been a virgin for a long time, and there were some girls who had broken through my wall of ice from time to time, and I indulged in a night or two with them in order to at least stave off loneliness or to keep Chester from busting my proverbial chops. But this was different. I was almost certain that Servana had never been with a man before. This most likely would be her first time. And most important, she loved me and wanted to know if I felt the same way. Her implied question was even more evident than her spoken one. Fortunately, I had known what the answer would be for perhaps a week. It took me a while to come to terms with what it meant for me, but I came to realize that my happiness, regardless of the consequences, was the most important thing. So I accepted it. Damn Chester, damn my family, damn this whole planet. I knew at last whom I belonged with, and to whom my heart belonged. 10 years had only forestalled the inevitable. I had fallen in love with Servana, and had merely been waiting for the right time to let her know. I kissed Servana with feverish passion. This was the first part of my answer. I believe my will gave her all the knowledge of my feelings that she needed in that kiss. While she was still dizzy with its intensity, I cupped my face in her hands and smiled with full confidence and certainty. "I want you," I said, divulging the second part, "and I love you." There was no movement in her face. Not a muscle twitched, but 2 tears ran down from her violet eyes, and her shuddering breaths were, for seconds after, the sole indicators of her feelings. "Vani," I whispered. "Jules," she replied in a voice that was just as soft. We said no more. My kiss was much gentler this time, but with no less emotion. I felt the skin beneath Servana's soft silken gray striped pelt grow warm against me as we slowly picked up where we left off. But soon I stopped us, before time began to grow fuzzy in the haze of our love and desire. I had no words to ask, however, no questions, as I stood and took Servana by the hand. She saw the intent in my eyes, and with like silence she followed me as I led her into the bedroom. Our actions were tentative as we loved each other for that first time, as well as curious. Servana and I both learned from one another in an experience that was at once awkward and blissful. I had known that anatomically Felians, excepting the Horakia type, were not terribly different from humans, but that was the limit of my knowledge. Tonight, experience taught us a great deal, chief among which was the fact that Felians were sensitive in some places where humans were not, one location among others being the base of the tail, a discovery that gave us quite a bit of delight in our foreplay. I could not help but laugh at Servana's incessant purring. It was such a delightful sound. But she still seemed to retain some self-consciousness about it, until I showed her my affinity for and attraction to it in more certain terms than verbal. Conversely, the point of my self-consciousness revealed itself when Servana had completely disrobed me. Outside of books, perhaps, she had never seen a human naked before. She was not unused to the sight of a being with so little hair, as Ankyphalians were hairless with the exception of the head and tail, but I was hairier than most human males, a fact that intimidated some girls of my species and left me a bit shy about it, despite my laziness at shaving. But Servana was comforted by the presence of my hair and could not stop running her fingers through it. Piece by piece, our clothes became a pile beside the bed, and I discovered that Servana was, in contrast to me, not the least bit ashamed of her body. She was, in fact, delighted at how attractive I saw her. Most humans on my world only saw upright talking animals when they observed her kya, but I observed a lovely female form, exotic in appearance perhaps, but no less beautiful or tempting than any human female. In fact, I could not help but feel some confusion as to how any human could not be envious of the lovely striped patterns upon Felian bodies. As I pulled at the fanciful knot that bound her top, and the last of Servana's clothes slipped away in the heat of our passion, I felt none of the revulsion that I'd been taught that I ought to feel. Rather, I felt drawn ever more strongly to her, and privileged at having one such as her to love. I took her hands in mine, and she slid into my welcoming arms. My hands ran through her luxurious fur, reaching down to her skin, and I touched her in as many places as I could. I tasted her with my kisses, and she did the same, experimenting with me as we had at the beginning with what felt best between us. Our bodies conjoined, and we held each other so close as to meld into one as we made love. Soon I forgot who and where I was. There was only Servana, the girl I'd loved since I saw her first dance years ago, now one with me tonight as we met the ultimate destiny of our emotions. Her purring transformed into low growls, and then breathless sighing cries, letting me know what I did right. We made passionate love, and she became my universe, enfolding me within herself as she siphoned me of all the love and desire that I had. In increasing increments, I gave ever more until we, in the fullness of time, released that culmination of love in its grandest expression. With Keisha, it took more times than I cared to count to exhaust myself to be free of the burn. With Servana, it took only once. We lay there afterwards, Servana resting supremely happy and breathing contented sighs upon my chest. My arm draped over her as I stroked her luxurious fur, and I realized that not only was I not exhausted, but to my amazement and utter relief, the burn had never come. And when Servana and I had made love, it did not end in the disappointing aftermath of disinterest and crippling fatigue. Rather, I was merely satisfied and happier than I had ever been in my life. I felt the love I had for her grow tenfold at the sight of her in peaceful repose, the emotion swelling in my heart, filling it to near bursting. "I love you," she said in a lilting whisper. She purred softly against my skin. "I love you," I replied with absolute conviction. I was never more certain of our love tonight, and I was no longer afraid or ashamed. Despite the indescribable joy of our first night, I suffered troubled dreams as I slept. It was strange and disturbing as I underwent dreams that made me think that my wonderful night with Servana had only been a dream itself. Disappointment and anguish forced me awake, and sensations returned to my body, chiefly the heaviness, softness, and warmth of Servana upon my chest. I smiled with joyful relief as I touched her, just to confirm her presence, and I felt a tear roll down the side of my face. "It felt like a dream," I said, murmuring the words of my wakefulness. "I know," I heard Servana reply, and her very real words and very real presence gave me a thrill of joy. "It did. But it wasn't, was it?" "No, it wasn't." My left arm wrapped around her waist, and I pulled her tighter against me, now fully assured that it was no dream. I inhaled the powdery scent of Servana's hair, felt the texture of her muscles as her side rose and fell in her breaths. She cuddled closer to me, and I could practically feel her smile. "Are you sleepy, Leah?" Servana asked. I felt a tingle move down my spine at the word that she used when referring to me. Lia was a very intimate word in their language, and never used lightly. It was the word that one used to another when they were mated. Using honey or darling was only the crudest of equivalents, as it had no real English translation. It was a sacred word that expressed the deepest level of love between a male and female. And she used it to refer to me. Before this month, I would have been terrified at the thought of being called such a thing by any Felian, but now it sounded right and perfect in my ears, and made me desire to hear her say it again. She was now mine, and I was hers. No distance would ever be able to change that. No, I replied. I'm too happy to sleep. You don't mind that I call you Lia? Savannah asked with some surprise. Not at all. In fact, I'm glad you did. I love you. She pressed herself against me and eyed me with her violet gaze. A purr rose up unbidden from within her as she nuzzled me. Lia tiari kai, I said, feeling the softness of her fur against my cheek and neck. I love you, my darling, always. We kissed, and it deepened, and we made love again. The week we had left was the very best of the time we spent together on Zinj, as we spent it in each other's arms where we belonged. Savannah left the room only once, and returned with items that came in handy to ensure our privacy, and others that would later enhance our intimacy. She had disabled the doorbell, placed a soundproof shield on the door, installed something that she called a randomizer on the lock, which she said made its code virtually unhackable, and then went gleefully back into bed with me, shuffling off her clothes with alacrity before hopping into my waiting arms. Otherwise, we hardly ever left the bed except to eat. Though I was nothing short of abysmal at cooking, I was happy to find that Savannah was fairly skilled at it, and used what few foodstuffs I had to make very satisfying meals for us. Of course, we had each other for dessert afterwards. As it had done innumerable times that week, the incoming call hologram appeared on my phone as it lay upon the dresser across from my bed. Lia, why won't you turn it off? Savannah murmured plaintively, her words coming in the background of soft, relaxed purring, as I applied the detangling ointment to her fur and massaged it into her skin. It was a type of oil that Felians used upon themselves, mostly for personal grooming, but it was often customary for mates to apply it to each other. The process was very intimate, as I learned, like a full body massage when done correctly, and Savannah was a very good teacher. The scent, I learned, was the same familiar aroma that had constantly emanated from her, something akin to baby powder. There might be an emergency, I replied, as I finished applying the ointment to her tail and reached for her brush. Well, so far it's only been your friend as usual, Savannah said, and hissed at the phone. He'll give up, I assured her. He hasn't yet. I sighed as the hologram faded away. Yeah, you're right, he hasn't. It was the fourth day, I learned from viewing the timestamp on a previous attempt of Chester's that had occurred when we had last woken up. Time had otherwise blurred together in those endless hours, becoming meaningless as Savannah and I indulged ourselves in each other. He's too damn persistent, I said with a deep, mildly annoyed sigh. You know I'd be with you this week. It's got too much personality and not enough patience. Savannah giggled at my remark, and then stiffened as my brush passed over the very sensitive base of her tail. She shuddered and growled softly and deeply as I passed its fine bristles over her luxurious fur, being especially soft and gentle upon this part. The reaction never failed to both amuse and arouse me, and my laugh was just as soft as her growl as I passed the brush several times upon the area. You're doing that on purpose, she said, trying to sound annoyed, but there was a betraying pleasured lilt in her voice that I could easily detect. Maybe, I said coyly. Her tail slapped me upon my side as she hissed faintly, but it was a playful, gentle slap. I saw a faint smile upon her muzzle as she cast a sideways glance at me. So are you really pissed, or are you just being frisky? I said, the scent of the ointment at the sight of Savannah's supine body, building up the desire that my grooming of her had already thoroughly stoked. Well now, that depends on whether or not you can finish the job without being frisky yourself, Savannah said, and rolled over onto her back. Laughing, I accepted her challenge and forced down my desire as I went back to work. By the way, who is Keisha? She asked suddenly as my hands neared her breasts. That question was like a bucket of cold water on me, eliminating every vestige of my arousal. This was something I hoped would not happen, as I had blocked Keisha's code from accessing my phone. Keisha? It was the only thing I could say. The question came out sounding utterly stupid in my ear. I saw that your friend had left you a message last night, Servana said. You were still asleep. He said that Keisha was wondering where you were, and wondering why you never returned her calls. I sighed with resignation. I'd expected this, of course. I knew that I'd have to tell Servana about this, but hoped that I wouldn't have to do it so soon. I sat up in the bed and curled my knees up to my chest. Servana, noticing the doubtless troubled look on my face, turned over to her side, facing me. I don't know how you'll take this, I said. You've probably already suspected that you're not the first woman I've been with, right? Servana nodded without word. I had intended to keep quiet about some of the things I knew to soften the sting of my confession, but my lips overrode my intentions, as if an angel were forcing me to purge my conscience of all its sordid contents. I told Servana everything. I told her about Keisha, the burn, our nights together, my confusion and my regret. I couldn't bear to look directly at her as I spoke, yet I could feel Servana's beautiful violet eyes fixed upon me as I talked on, like a balloon inflated with sin releasing its contents to a tiny hole. I'm not a virgin, Vani, I said in conclusion, but I had little interest in women until I met you, and then, well, you know the rest. Drained and without excuse, my eyes tightened as I, guilty by my own word, waited for the storm of reproach that it was certain would come. Whom do you love? Servana asked. Her question, utterly and completely unexpected, caught me utterly and completely off guard. I blinked the tears from my eyes as I once again settled my gaze upon Servana. Like an angel, there was no look of anger in her lovely eyes, no condemnation. Her face was completely devoid of accusation. Whom do I sputtered. Whom do you love? Servana asked again, her voice without any inflection that betrayed anything negative. Well, you, of course, I said, still amazed that this conversation had even taken such an unforeseen turn. Are you certain of this? Servana asked. I've never been more certain in my life. And are you my Leah, as I am yours? I crawled to her and took her hand in my own. Vani, if I had my pick of any woman on this planet but was denied you, I'd choose celibacy, I said with an earnestness that burned from the depths of my heart. I would be sterilized before I'd choose any other girl. Were it allowed and were it possible, I would have you bear my children. I've loved you since we were children, Vani. My Leah. My only regret is not having had the boldness to act upon my feelings sooner. Then there's nothing to forgive, she whispered. And just like that, it was over. I rejoiced in this as we kissed. All the shame and confusion of the times of the burn vanished at her touch and her kiss, and fell into soft bed sheets to bring the joy that I felt at her forgiveness, and that love once again into its fullest expression. Servana and I never spoke of Keisha again in the time that we had left, but I had forgotten to settle the whole affair on the other end. Keisha, unfortunately, never forgot, but that was to be the least of my worries. It was the day before Servana was to leave, and I awoke to an empty bed. A note addressed to me, however, staved off the spell of disappointment I felt at this. I opened it and read its contents written in Servana's elegant cursive. I'm sorry to have left you so abruptly. Meet me at the place where we first met this evening, my Leah. Vani. I got dressed, already feeling lonely. I discovered that Servana had taken all her belongings, including the privacy devices. The impending, inevitable day of her departure was now closer to my mind than ever, and I had to fight off the depression that threatened to overshadow my thoughts. I would meet Servana in the amphitheater tonight, and we would have at least one more night. I kept repeating this promise to myself like a mantra as I made my bed for the first time in a week, and then proceeded to clean the house. I had let things get too messy. The only place that was clean by any stretch of the imagination was, in fact, the area where I kept my artwork. I tried, but could not keep my mind on my work. My thoughts repeatedly returned to Servana in the last 5 days we shared together. I was in love with her in a way that I never thought I could be, and wanted nothing more than for her and me to be together in a place where we would never need to worry about separation. I'd lost her as a child. I couldn't bear losing her again. I felt that I would shatter into dust inside on the day we'd have to say goodbye. I went back to the shelf with all my works arranged upon it like trophies that were ghosts of glory days. My eyes automatically found the necklace that I brought back to its original resting place. Its silver surface and tear-shaped amethyst sparkled in the room's dim light, as if speaking the words that I ought to hear. It was clear to me now. There were no doubts of what I needed to do. I took the necklace and draped it over my neck, fastening it and tucking it safely away under my shirt. As I did this, a thrill of expectation replaced my previous melancholy. I did not know what to expect when I met Servana at Blue Point tonight, but she wouldn't be the only one with a surprise. My phone rang, and, as expected, it was Chester. I touched the talk icon on the hologram. "It's about time you answered your phone." The volume of his shout caused me to hold the phone away from my ear. "I've been trying to get through to you all week." "I've been preoccupied," I said, knowing that I would not be able to lie to him about what had been going on. And you know that. I told you I'd be, remember?" "Yeah, but I didn't think you'd shut me completely out," Chester snapped. "I mean, what the hell?" "Look, if you just called to chew me out, I'll hang up," I warned him. Wait, Chester said with a much calmer tone. I didn't call to give you any trouble. Can I come over?" I sighed, reminding myself of how helpful Chester had been to me, despite his incessant attempts to call during the last couple of days that Servana and I had been together. "Yeah, sure," I said less enthusiastically. "I know that Keisha's been having kittens," I said as Chester stepped through the doorway. "I'm going to have to find some way to make it up to her, I guess." "I wouldn't bother," Chester said casually. "She said that she's, how did she put it, done with your schizophrenic ass." "Really?" I said, genuinely surprised at the news. "You completely avoided her for the last 5 days, Jules," Chester said, spreading his arms outward. "Hell, you've been avoiding me as well. What'd you think was going to happen?" I forced myself to suppress the expression of relief before it could come to my face. Nevertheless, I felt it swell within me like a rush of cooling water over a parched desert of worry that I'd forgotten was there. After confessing to Servana, I had all but forgotten about Keisha. This solved a potential problem that would have waited for me in the wings to take me by surprise. Quickly, however, I feigned disappointment, sagging my shoulders and affecting a properly crestfallen look. "Oh," I said in a suitably dismal tone. "Hey, don't worry about it," Chester said in a cheerful tone. He slapped me on the back. "There's a whole planet full of unfixed girls out there. Plenty of fish left in the pond and all that. And besides, I know it wasn't your fault. I hung up on the Servana friend of yours." I silently thanked God that Chester didn't know the truth as I allowed a smile to return to my face. I was not ashamed of anything that had happened in the previous days, but I knew that my friend would never understand. "That, however, is the very reason I wanted to come by," Chester said, looping his arm around my neck. "I know the cat dogs are going to be leaving soon, like you said, but I know what spending so much time around a girl you're close to, in a platonic way, can do to you, failure or not. So, I don't want you moping around like a lost puppy when she leaves." He led me back to the door. "Got stuff to do today?" "Not until tonight," I answered suspiciously. "Why?" "Now that would be telling," Chester said with roguish glee. "Just trust your friend's intuition." "Your intuition has led to more drinks getting thrown in my face than down my throat," I said flatly. Details," Chester said, and I followed him out the door. We boarded a train for Blue Point, which surprised me at first. Chester's idea of partying tended to be much simpler than what Cerulean provided. Still, I took some comfort in our location. It was at least convenient for tonight, provided Chester's little surprise didn't take long. I thought of telling him more about my previous engagement, but then thought better of it. After we disembarked, Chester had not led me through pavilions as I expected, but down a side path into a branching cavern that housed a bazaar that I had not seen before, even during my escapades with Servana. The booths sold a cornucopia of odd and obscure items from every colony world, and even some that the vendors claimed, most likely fraudulently, to be from the dead world of Hulsk and the mysterious planet of Larevlis, which no human had ever visited. Chester and I passed quickly through the shopping district of the weird, and after about half a mile stopped at a house that had been carved into the rock wall at the cavern's far end. The banner above its door was written in a highly decorative form of Cyrillic, which I could not read, but I understood the stylized Z that was posted at the side of the door quite well. "What is this place?" I asked ominously. "All your dreams come true," Chester said as he led me up the staircase to the front door. "Zaid owns it," I protested. "Yeah, and?" "I really don't like this," I said. "Will you relax? It'll be fun, I promise." His reassurances, as always, had the opposite effect. But I was here now, and figured that I might as well bite the bullet with whatever fun that Chester had dug up for me, though I was almost certain of what it was. A tall, middle-aged woman clad in a filmy blue evening gown and wearing jewels that glittered upon her neck, ears, and her lightly graying hair answered the door. Her face lit up at the sight of Chester, and she spoke excitedly in a language that was as incomprehensible as the script upon the banner above. Chester seemed to understand, and responded in like language, gesturing to me occasionally. During the conversation, the woman appeared to become momentarily concerned as Chester talked, and then sighed as he presented his bank card to her. She ran a scanning wand over it, and then motioned for us to come inside. "What was that all about?" I asked Chester, and I followed the woman. I asked as Chester and I followed the woman through a long corridor that was lined with wooden panels, intricate paintings, and filled with an invigorating, spicy aroma. "Just standard business talk and all that," Chester said dismissively. "This place is used to getting a certain type of clientele. She wanted to make sure that you were okay." "Okay?" I echoed. "Just follow the nice lady, all right?" Chester said as we stopped next to a door. The woman opened it and said something to Chester once again. "This is my stop," he said to me. She'll show you to your room." The giggling behind the door was unmistakable. "You sent me to a brothel?" I nearly shrieked. "A Zadian brothel? Chester, are you out of your—" "Relax, friend," Chester said, resting his hand heavily on my arm. "Relax and enjoy yourself for once." A slender white arm clad in silvery bangles grabbed Chester and dragged him inside. The door shut before I could say another word. I turned quickly to the woman who had led us inside and grinned nervously. Look," I began, though I was fairly certain she was unable to understand me. "I appreciate your kindness and such, but—" She gestured further down the hall. "Look, you don't understand," I said, despite the obvious language barrier. "I don't do brothels. I've got it." She moved a few paces down the hall and opened a door. With the same inviting smile, she gestured inside. Groaning, I shuffled over to the door and decided that a peek would not hurt. I wanted to at least know what I would be chewing Chester out over the next day. What I saw was a nightmare. I expected some exotic women, perhaps scantily dressed at the most, naked at the worst, but no, this was much, much worse, as what I saw within was not even human. They were Felians. 2 Ankya-Felians and a red-furred Reykja-Felian lay supine and naked upon the luxurious bed, their eyes half-lidded and glassy-looking as they cast vacant, wanton smiles in my direction. One whiff was all the explanation I needed. The room smelled strongly of reese, a dried herb that Sarvana used when we made love. It was an aphrodisiac that enhanced the experience of sex for Felians, but also clouded their minds somewhat. I saw through the filmy curtains that surrounded the bed that each of them wore a steel collar, and that upon each collar was the same tiny ornate Z that had been posted beside the brothel's entrance door, marking them as Zadian slaves. I would not hide my revulsion. The Zadians had been trafficking in Felian slaves, and sex slaves at that. I staggered back, my face a mask of horror, of the horror I felt in every fiber of my being. How could Chester have even thought I'd appreciate this? I took no pleasure in corralling the slaves we were allowed on Zinj, but accepted it as part of life, and the slaves we used were either indentured servants or convicts. Felians were outside of the jurisdiction of the colonies. There was no way they could have possibly known about this. The woman who had led Chester and me into the house questioned me in a reproachful tone, but I was at a loss to say anything. Not that she would have understood me anyway. My steps were ungainly. I was still reeling from my own shock and disgust. But I managed to turn myself around, just short of knocking over what looked like a very expensive miniature grandfather clock that rested upon a fancy table. Sidling awkwardly about it, I made my exit, coming just short of breaking into a full-on run. This I saved for when I exited the building. My thoughts were so overwhelmed with terror and shock over what I'd seen that I remembered nothing of my run, save the complaints of the people I bumped into on the way back to the train station. The only thing on my mind was that I had to get as far away from that place as I could. I felt my heart pound and my thoughts overflow when I finally had a moment to myself in the train, where I'd sought out some of the abandoned cars. God, why? I croaked, resting my head in my hands. Fellions were normally so lively. To see them like I had degraded to pleasure toys and kept under the mind-fuddling effects of Reese and whatever drugs that they used made me sick to my stomach. Using humans for that kind of work was bad enough. Even worse was how the elders tolerated it, only because the Zadians tied their income from their particular trade to the government. But they had no right to do this to Fellions. Why did you let me see that? I had to know. I had to ask Sarvana. She deserved to know this, or at least let me know if her people knew. If she knew. If she did, then I had nothing to worry about, and I just embarrassed myself severely, if only to avoid being unfaithful to the girl I loved. But if they didn't, then at least I could help right a terrible wrong before Sarvana and I would be separated. She had no phone, but I knew that I could contact the ship from my computer. And if not her, I could at least get the word out to someone aboard who would at least hear out the ranting of some random human. I had nothing to lose either way. If I could have done it, I would have ripped the door to my home off of its hinges rather than put in the code. I hurried over to my computer and brought up the ShipCom app. No sooner had the app opened up than there came a knock at the door. I froze as fright struck me like a right cross to my sternum. I forced control upon myself, fighting doggedly against fright as I moved with great trepidation towards the door. I unsheathed my knife, not knowing what to expect. I pressed the comm button beside the door. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice making the sound terse. "The police! Open up!" Almost at the same time, an initial fright and then subsequent release shot through me, mixed with an annoyed chagrin, as I first thought that it really had been the police, and then realized the voice was just a playful affectation of a bass, and then finally realizing whose voice it was. I opened the door, and Keisha leaped into my arms. Her lips were quick to press against mine, extinguishing any protest. "Happy to see me, lover?" she then whispered in my ear. "Keisha?" I sputtered in surprise at both her unexpected presence and her equally unexpected lack of anger. "Chester told me that you—" "Yeah, about that," Keisha said, a bit confused that I had not returned her affections, but undaunted. "I did a little thinking and realized that I was just being selfish. After all, we did it for almost a full month. It's only natural that one of us would have needed some breathing space. I wasn't being fair to you. With me, I guess it's just my bitchiness that got through. After all, people carry at least a little baggage into relationships, right?" I stared at her with momentary astonishment. She was presuming a lot to think that we had any kind of relationship. At best, our rendezvous over this past month had been little more than a series of booty calls. But perhaps she was into wishful thinking. Either way, I didn't have time for this. She could not have picked a more inopportune time to forgive me and attempt to pick up where we left off. I needed to get rid of her, and fast, but was at a loss of how to let her off easy. I could procrastinate, but she didn't look like she would have accepted something so half-assed. More than anything, her leading me into the bedroom made me realize that she would not take no for an answer. I think that my lack of action as she did this was only because I was amazed at how quickly she moved. Until now, I had no idea of how high pressure she was when it came to relationships. But now, as she plopped herself onto the edge of the bed, I was getting a front row seat to it. "Wait a sec. What are you doing?" I asked, as if I didn't know what Keisha's removing her blouse meant. "What do you mean, what am I doing?" Keisha said with a laugh. "Jules, it's been a week. I knew you needed some you time, but I wasn't tired at all." She grabbed my wrist and pressed it to her breast. "Come on, Jules, take me." "Look, Keisha," I began, my mind racing with frantic desperation as to what I could say. "I think we need to talk about some things before we—" "Let's talk sex now," Keisha said, and used my tenuous footing born of my nervousness to pull me into her grasp. My protests were suppressed by both her lips and her tongue. "Still want to talk?" she breathed into my ear when she at last released my mouth from her own. "You gotta want it after—" I said nothing to stop her. Rather, she paused mid-sentence of her own volition as she sniffed the air. A strange expression was on her face. "What the—" she said with a sudden incredulity that I did not comprehend. What's wrong? I asked, at the same time confused and thankful for the reprieve, however brief. She sniffed again. I know that smell, she said, her expression at first distant and blank. This time she wrinkled her nose in disgust. Ugh! That nasty powdery smell. It smells like... Her eyes went to my pillow where I had placed Servana's note after I made my bed. My eyes followed, and my mind conjured up the loudest and most profane curse I could muster. Keisha grabbed the paper and read it. In a flash, her eyes widened, and I knew that I was buggered 50 ways till Friday. In contempt, she tossed the paper aside and eyed me with a gaze that was filled with more rage than I had ever seen on any of the worst drunks in the pleasure house. Good God, Jules! You mean to tell me that you've been skipping me to spend the last week playing I the sausage with a cat dog? She spat the last vulgar word out in a shrill voice that made me jump. No wonder why it stinks like one of them in here. She stopped and her eyes fell upon her hand. Some of the ointment that had been on the covers had not yet completely dried, I suppose, as she picked the bits of fur that had stuck onto her hand. She acted as if she touched a cockroach after that, reacting in a flurry of disgusted shrieks and shaking the fibers from her hand as she launched herself off of my bed. Oh, ew, it's everywhere, she exclaimed, brushing the fur off of her clothes as if someone had set them on fire. Was she a Reykjavian? Yes, she was, I said, at last given a chance to get a word in edgewise, but immediately I wished I hadn't. What the hell is wrong with you? Keisha's look of disgusted shock intensified, and her fist clipped me smartly against my chest, the pain of the blow in my racing mind causing me to step awkwardly back to avoid another strike. Are you into animals or something? I was completely without word or actions, caught in Keisha's tirade. I could do nothing but step backwards with every step she took towards me. What's the matter with me? She shrieked, her voice now breaking with tears that would not be long in coming. Was I not good enough? Are humans not good enough for you? Why would you do something like that to me? I tripped backwards over a chair beside my breakfast table and fell backside first onto the floor. I twisted my ankle slightly and tried to stand, but the stabbing pain radiating from my injured ankle kept knocking me off balance. I scuttled across the floor, half dragging myself as Keisha stalked ever closer. To my horror, consternation, and grief, she went to my artwork shelves and one by one yanked them from where they stood. I can't believe I let you touch me! With each screeching cadence, a piece of art flew across the room. A figurine shattering the vase my sister got me for my 18th birthday, an anklet knocking a book off of the bookshelf, a sculpture chipping the vitroplast of the tank at the center of the living room. It was all I could do to shield myself from Keisha's enraged barrage. I felt my back hit the door, and frantically I reached up towards the unlock button. A flying glass sculpture barely missed my fingers as it struck the wall, but a tiny shard sliced through my hand, grazing me. I yanked the injured limb back, but the wound did not hurt. Hurriedly, I reached up again and pressed the button before Keisha got lucky. I should have figured that amidst the screaming, the neighbors would have figured that something was amiss and called the police. I stumbled out into the corridor and managed to right myself. People were standing around, attracted to the commotion from my home, staring at me and turning their heads sharply towards the door, from which Keisha's screaming tirade could still be heard coming closer. What's her problem? I heard someone say beside me. What did you do? She's crazy, I answered plaintively. I was too busy gathering the shattered remains of my dignity to search out who said it. Look out! I heard someone shout, and I saw several people scatter in my peripheral vision. I never saw what hit me. I was dazed in a flood of garbled voices. I felt hands grasp me harshly, and a screaming, incomprehensible voice shouting as I was shaking violently. Then I was dropped to the ground, and the voices became clearer. Can't do anything with him unconscious, lady. Now if you can calm down and tell me what happened. It was a man's voice. I looked towards its source and saw the unmistakable polished leather boots of the policeman several feet away. He's been sleeping with some alien bitch! Keisha shrieked. I told you that already! Hey, he's coming around, I heard someone say in a voice several octaves higher. I noticed another set of boots approaching, and I pushed myself off the ground. Pain shot through me from scratches and bruises that I did not have before, and my head was pounding. Are you okay? One of the officers helped me to my feet and steadied me. He looked a little bit like Chester, except there were no freckles, and his hair was mostly gone. You need a medic? No, I answered, my words coming out in a mumble. No, I'm fine. I was just dazed, that's all. I got hit by something. Is he okay, Cole? The other officer said. Does he still need the medic team? No, I told the officer beside me. I'm fine, really. He says he's fine, the officer called out to his partner, and then spoke into the comm unit on his wrist. Cancel previous med team dispatch to Alpha Res sector. Acknowledged, came the voice on the other side in a crackle of static. Get him over here, the other officer called out. I've got to scan him. Can you walk? The almost Chester-looking officer asked me. Yeah. I was a bit less than certain of it, but walking turned out to be easier than I thought. Still, my legs felt like lead weights. This wasn't because of anything from the previous blow to my head, however. I just heard the words that I dreaded. And it was a known fact that Felians, after sex with a human, left a residual genetic trace on and in the bodies of their mates, making subtle changes to their DNA. There was no way to mask it, and I had been with Servana for a week. The bed was evidence that was damning enough. Scanning me would confirm everything. The officer stayed at my side until I approached his partner, a stern-faced, dark-haired man almost as thickly built as I was. You're Julius Galloway, he said. Yeah. I turned and saw that Keisha was handcuffed to a nearby post. She said nothing, only glowered at me as most of her rage had boiled down to a simmer. You've been accused of genetic crimes, the officer said. We checked your home and found traces of Felian DNA and human DNA in various bodily fluids. Therefore, I am required by law to inform you that an unsterilized human breeding outside his species is a first-order genetic offense. If found guilty, penalty is mandatory sterilization and forfeiture of your property rights to be carried out immediately. He held up a flat, white plastic wand in front of me. A blue light shone at its end. I'm required to perform a residual genetic scan to confirm suspicions. Do you understand this? I nodded silently. I felt completely numb all over. Everything had gone south in a proverbial heartbeat. Why did Keisha have to make such a commotion to the point where the police could not help but be involved? Now my fate was sealed. I would never see Servana again. The only emotion that broke through my wall of numbness was the pain I felt at what she would think of me for standing her up tonight, especially after such a long time together. I'm not ashamed at what we did, my Leah, I thought as the wand's blue became red, telling the officer all he needed to know. I'd do it 1,000,000 times for you. I barely felt the handcuffs upon me. I love you so much, Fanny, my Leah. I hope you can someday forgive me for vanishing like I did. I barely remembered the trip to the police station. Keisha, arrested on charges of aggravated assault and disturbing the peace, was seated beside me, but she scooted away into her corner of the car once I was secured. Once we arrived at the precinct, we were separated, and she was taken to a different holding area. I wasn't processed like she or the other suspects were. Instead, I was led to a separate room, sterile and white. A voice ordered me to sit down in that room's sole chair. When I did, I felt a stinging cold sensation upon my neck, and everything went black. And that's it for today's part. I will continue this very soon. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. And as usual, I would really appreciate some feedback. Leave it down there in the description, not description, excuse me, in the comment section, or you can PM me if you like. Until next time, guys. This is DecKrash, better known as Brandon. Stay lucky and stay blessed.